Today, I'm going to cover the idea of Israel in Second Temple Judaism, a new theory of people, exile, and Israelite identity by Dr. Jason A. Staples. This is book 27 for my 2021 reading list. Well, I have Jason with me here today, and we're going to discuss this book a bit, and then I'm going to ask him some questions about it. So to start off here, Israel, fairly non-controversial topic or concept. Just go through a little bit of the history and then get into my first question for Jason. So Israel, we come across the name in the Hebrew Bible in the book of Genesis, where Jacob, his name becomes Israel after he fights with God. After that, Jacob/Israel has 12 sons. They become the 12 tribes of Israel. Later on, we have the kingdom of Israel, but that's split up into the northern kingdom, which is called Israel, and the southern kingdom, which is the kingdom of Judah. Well, the kingdom of Israel, they first go into exile with the Assyrians who attack them. They go into exile 722 BCE, otherwise known as BC when I was in school. And then later on, the Babylonians come into the kingdom of Judah, take them away into exile into Babylon. Jerusalem is in Judah, and the temple that is in Jerusalem gets destroyed. A few years later, 70 plus or minus, I guess, some of the tribes from Judah come back to that area and they start building the temple. They start rebuilding the temple. Now we have the idea of the Second Temple, which is the period of time that this book takes place in. So it's upon the return, the building of this Second Temple until 70 AD, when the Romans destroyed that Second Temple. That's the period of time where this book takes place. Now, to complicate matters even further, in the last 100 years, now we have a country that is called Israel. But other countries, some of them don't even recognize this country that's called Israel. So, Jason, Israel, so many different ideas here, people groups, countries, tribes, individual. What are we to make of this? And that's what this book goes into. This is what you are addressing. And to understand what the idea of Israel means, you state that we have to go back to the source material. And we have to go back to the author's writing at that time. And so that's what you do in this book. You go back to the biblical writers, you go back to Josephus, Philo, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Apocrypha, other books and writers during this time to find out how were these terms actually used. So with that in mind, what does modern scholarship say about the term Israel? And what have you found in your 17 years of research in terms of what Israel means, and then Israel as compared to Jew, Hebrew, and Samaritan?
Yeah, and this is tricky. So first of all, thanks for having me rejoin what for a long time we were co-hosting together, and maybe in the future we'll do some more of these co-hosted once I'm actually done writing some of these really, really, really long projects. But yeah, the first thing to talk about here is that when you're dealing with language, words mean what people use them to mean in a given context, right? So a specific sound or a specific word, specific set of phonemes doesn't have an inherent meaning, right? It has the meaning that it's used to mean within a given conversation or discourse by people who agree on the parameters of what that means, right? So in English, can means something different than that combination of words in other languages, right? Or that combination of sounds in other languages. Mm-hmm. And by agreement of the speakers, that word takes on its meaning. So what this means is, if you want to understand what a word means or how people are using a given word at a given time or in a given discourse, a given conversation, you really need to look at how they're using that word in its context within that discourse. And it may not be the same thing that word means in other time periods once the conversation has moved to other things. So today, if I were going to use the word Israel, obviously it's going to mean, it's as often as not, it's going to mean the nation state in the Middle East, right? So that that complicates things. The question for me when I was looking at this book is, when someone from the ancient world, and in particular that period between the building of the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem and then the destruction of that rebuilt temple, what did people in that period mean when they used the term Israel, or basically the ancient language cognates of it, so Israelos or Yisrael, or similar things with Yehudim, Yehudaios. These are words that are normally translated Jew today, which came through Latin and then Greek, or through Latin and then German into English. But what I wanted to do is look to see how they're using those words, and specifically what concepts or people groups or these things, ethnicity and culture, are always bound up with other ideas. What were those ideas that are bound up in these terms, and how are they related? And so that's really what I was trying to get at in this book. And really the reason for that is that there's a lot of debate when you're starting to look at, say, the New Testament, or in certain documents within that period that are written by various Jews or people who claim to be Israelites, claim the heritage of Israel, as to what exactly, who counts, who's in, who's really an Israelite, who's out, who's not really an Israelite. And you can't really even scratch the bottom of those conversations. You can't get at what those conversations are about until you understand how they're using the terms, because that's a lot of what is actually going on there. So basically, one of the other big problems that came up, that this was sort of early in the process, is I noticed that there were a lot of biblical scholars who were aware of the fact that, say, the terms for Jew. So, and I'm just for the rest of the conversation, I'm just going to shorthand. I'm just going to say in English what these terms are, instead of talking about the cognate terms in the ancient languages. But the word for Jew is used in a lot of cases, and then the word for Israel or Israelite is used in a lot of cases. And you would expect that if those words were, if they meant the same group of people, or if they were coterminous essentially, or if they had the same, if they were functionally synonymous, they meant the same group, then you would expect them to kind of occur, if you did the scatter plot of how these words are used, you'd expect them to be used kind of interchangeably, but they're not. And it turns out that there's some distinctive patterns of where they occur and where they don't. And there'd been some efforts to try to explain those patterns. That, the reason that the most popular one that for the last 70 or so years has been this idea that Jew was an outsider term. It was a term that was used sometimes in a derogatory fashion by outsiders, but Israel or Israelite was the term that was preferred by insiders. And so, this is the inside term that was preferred. And they would use the outsider term when talking with outsiders for accommodation purposes, but when among other insiders, then they would use the more preferred term. And there are lots of examples of terms working this way. I mean, the term gypsy, for example, is an exonym, as it's called, an outsider term that is basically, it means something other than what basically you've got in the insider notion. It's a term that is kind of a slur. And the insider term, the people who are often by outsiders called gypsies, they tend to call themselves Romani, right? These Romani people, in fact, in the 1960s, rejected the term gypsy entirely as a term to describe them, as a slur, as a derogatory thing, and saying basically, we won't accept anybody calling us this anymore. So, and you've got examples of this. And so this was the way that these terms were approached within biblical scholarship, within studies on early Judaism, looking at this period. it's just kind of been assumed that basically by the time you get into the Second Temple period, Israelite means Jew. Jew is equivalent essentially to Israelite, and that these are sort of related in that way.
Mhm.
But the problem is that the data, when you look more closely at the data, those things break down really quickly. Uh, that narrative or that explanation doesn't hold up very well. And a number of people had pointed this out, that, there needs to be an awful lot of exceptions for this to work. And so that was one of the things that really stimulated me to write this book, was to try to get to the bottom of that problem and explain, to give a better explanation for what these terms actually meant and how they were used by people in that time period. And ultimately, one of the things that was most interesting to me was the origin. I didn't realize that the origin of that insider outsider explanation was actually Carl G. Kuhn, who wrote the entry for the theological, or the Theologisches Wörterbuch, the theological dictionary of the New Testament, back in the 1930s. And if you can't tell, that was a work that was done in Germany in the 1930s. And the guy who wrote it, it turns out, if you do a little digging, joined the Nazi Party in 1932. And so then when you start reading his work, you kind of have to have a little bit of an extra antenna up, like, wait a second, I got to make sure that this guy's actually representing the data properly. And it turns out, again, when you actually look at the data and when you look at his interpretation of it, one of the things that sticks out is you go, it's interesting. He says this is an outsider term that's sometimes used in a derogatory fashion. And in another place in that article, he talks about the derogatory nuance, the depreciatory nuance that so easily attaches itself to the term Jew, as opposed to Israelite. And this is why, of course, they prefer the more insider term. But then when you start looking in the ancient literature for that stuff, when you start looking for the derogatory nuance, it doesn't show up in ancient literature. And you go, well, where did he get that? Oh, wait. If you go to Germany in the 1930s and you call someone a Jew, that was derogatory. Yeah. And it turns out that the Jewish people in Germany tended to prefer to call themselves the Israelitische Gemeinde, the Israelite community of a given town or whatever, rather than the Juden of that town, because the one tended to be used as a slur by outsiders, and the other tended to be regarded with respect due to its biblical heritage. So once I saw that, it was like, okay, there really needs to be a better explanation for this. And that's really where this book goes, is trying to explain how this book is, or how these terms are used and what they mean and how they relate to one another in the ancient world, and then what some of the implications of that are.
Yeah. And the other issue here is, during that period, during the Second Temple Judaism, there's another glaring problem. As you identify, Israel does not exist. So what do you do with that? And you identify in the very first page of the book that this whole project, this whole inquiry was started because of Jeremiah 31 through 34, where it talks about the house of Israel and the house of Judah. But Jeremiah is writing at a time where the house of Israel has not existed for 100 years. So what in the world does he mean by the house of Israel? And that, you said that was one of the sparks of this inquiry as well. And so it seems there's kind of two ways to go about that. One is that the returning exiles to Judah, that they took on the name Israel. And that's where you might have what you're saying, maybe in modern scholarship, where the terms are equal, in the sense that this group came back. They were called the Jews because they were from the tribe of Judah. But since Israel no longer existed, they took on that term for themselves. So then you could use those terms interchangeably. But what you noticed in the literature that time is that that's not how those terms were used at all. And if Israel does not exist at that time, but people are writing about Israel, what in the world does it mean?
Right. And part of that is it's specifically, you have to go back to the time before the exiles, where you actually did have a nation state named Israel. It was a tribal community that was led by a monarch of sorts. that called itself Israel, and they were related to, in many respects, religiously and otherwise, to the group to the south of them that called themselves Judah, right? And in the Bible, of course, these two kingdoms originally came from one group and split off from one another due to some rivalry and some other political factors. And the one in the north is the one that actually kept the title Israel, or the name Israel, and the one in the south went by the name of the big tribe there, the tribe of Judah. But that the whole thing is Israel, which of course is introducing confusion right from the start over what is Israel, who is Israel. Well, Israel is either the northern kingdom but not the southern kingdom, like you refer to Israel and Judah is not Israel, or you refer to all Israel, or you refer to Israel in the larger sense, and that's Israel and Judah together as the whole picture. And so the thing in Jeremiah 31 that you mentioned is that basically Jeremiah is prophesying the destruction of Judah, the Jerusalem is the seat of the Judahite king at the time, and Jeremiah is saying Jerusalem's going to go down. Judah itself is going to fully cease to exist as an independent nation and all this. But one day God is going to restore the house of Israel and the house of Judah, which is a way of referring to both parts of the larger body of Israel. And that's a way of designating that northern part. But again, the northern kingdom of Israel had long ceased to exist. And that's, like you said, that was a big part of what stimulated my interest in this to begin with, was, wait a second, if Jeremiah is saying the house of Israel is going to come back and they're going to be restored, what exactly does he mean by that 150 years after the destruction of the northern kingdom? And then, of course, what do later readers in the Second Temple period think Jeremiah means by that? Because they're looking around and they're going, yeah, the northern kingdom hasn't existed like this, from way before Jeremiah. So what's he referring to, and what do they expect? And so a lot of the book then traces through a lot of those things. Now, I should say, it's important to mention, and this is another important part of this book, is it's not exactly accurate to say that there was no Israel after say the 8th century, when Assyria destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel, because there were Israelites who were left behind in the land, some. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, the Jewish narrative is that lots of those Israelites intermarried with non-Israelites, and so they sort of ceased to be real Israelites, as it were. But even in the time of Jesus, in the very late part of the Second Temple period, right before the Second Temple is destroyed, you have a group of people that are significant rivals to the Jews in the South that call themselves Israelites. They're the people that in the New Testament they call Samaritans. Those people call themselves Israelites, and they're called Israelites by outsiders. And even Jews in the period are, they don't, you've got some disagreement among some Jews as to whether or not they really count as Israelites. Most Jews seem to have rejected the idea that they're real Israelites, and again, part of that has to do with, well, they're here and they're not really in unity with us, and they are, intermarried with various people. So we'll understand them as outsiders. They're not really who they claim to be. But there were some Jews, even after the Second Temple period, who looked at them and said, they're not Jews, and their practices are suspect in certain respects, but they're Israelites. I mean, there was some acceptance of that by some Jews. So that automatically, that gives you a group that's not Jewish. They claim to be Israelites. They are called Israelites by outsiders as well. And so that shows you right there that they're not exactly identical. And that's a really important piece for understanding how these terms are used in that time period. So all of those things go together to kind of explain what's happening here.
Yeah. So looking at that, what I want to kind of break this down on what this means, because we're talking about a period a long time ago. You're looking at literature that was a long time ago. What does this mean for us today? Like, how has this reached us today? And in three sources in particular, and you can just take these one at a time, but what does it mean in scholarship? How have how have the equating of Jew and Israel, how has that made its way into scholarship, and how has it impacted scholarship? Secondly, how has it impacted modern culture, just in our conception of the terms Jew, Hebrew, Israel, Samaritan? So modern culture. But then third, just at the personal level, like me, Eric Rostad, 2021, Franklin, Tennessee. What impact does that have? What does understanding these terms correctly, how they were used during Second Temple Judaism, how does that impact these three areas?
Yeah, so those are three pretty disparate questions. The first thing is in scholarship, like I said, the primary thing was that up until recently, up until essentially my work, the assumption has been that that basically Jews after the exile claimed the whole heritage of Israel, and so essentially Jew became synonymous with Israelite,
Mhm.
right? And so maybe they're used a little bit differently, but that's basically how this works.
So does that mean
Uh,
like the translation wise, then somebody translating an ancient text would just interchangeably use those terms?
in some cases, that has happened. Now, more careful scholars who are more inclined towards verbal precision in their translations have tended not to do that anyway. But the understanding when you interpret it still has been, when it says Israelite, it means the Jews. When it
Yeah.
says Israel, it means the Jews. When it says Israelite, it means a Jew. That's what that means. Uh, so that's been the general assumption. And then, of course, the explanation for why they're used differently has typically been that insider outsider explanation.
Mhm.
Uh, that has had a pretty big impact on a lot of things theologically. I mean, certainly in terms of discussions about Christian origins, when, you've got a lot of discussion about Israel in the New Testament. And for example, in Romans 9 to 11, Paul talks a lot about Israel and Israel's salvation, and exactly who is he talking about? Well, a lot of modern scholars just assume that when Paul says Israel or Israelites, he obviously means Jews. But if they're not identical, then maybe we're not understanding exactly what he's saying in that context. So that's an important piece, and that's actually what my second book is working through, is to say, once we understand the distinction here, does that, when we turn and we read some of these other texts, particularly in Christianity, in early Christian texts, and we see how they're using these terms, maybe that clears up some of the and I think it does. I think it clears up a lot of the places where people feel like, Paul may be contradicting himself here, or, it's not, it seems strange that he's talking all about equal Gentile participation in the Christian community, and then all of a sudden he flips the script and says, well, but all Israel, Israel has a special advantage, but over here he says, Jews and Greeks are equal in this regard. So how do we square that circle? Well, I think part of it is understanding the distinction between the terms that Paul would have assumed that other people wouldn't. So that's one extremely important kind of implication, and this works through rabbinic literature. This works through all sorts of other early Jewish material, where you start to look at what they're actually saying and what they're expecting, and it looks a little bit different once you understand the distinctions in those terms. So that's sort of number one and number two there. As for number three, how this impacts Eric Rostad and, Eric's legions of fans, it depends, because, if you are, so there are political implications of this, there are theological implications of this, and then there are notions that neither really ultimately should be impacted, depending on, how much credence you actually put into these ancient texts, right? So if you are an American Christian who really wants to know about what the prophet's promises are referring to, and wants to know what it looks like to support Israel, then having a good sense of how, say, Jesus and Paul and the earliest Christians understood these concepts would have a lot of impact on how you understand what it is to say support Israel. And that, has political implications, that has theological implications. and more. For a lot of people, it doesn't have it's an antiquarian question, right? It doesn't really matter because they're not really all that concerned with, say, what Paul or Jesus think, or what, say, Rabbi Hillel thinks, or what Philo thought. That's not really of concern, other than the fact that we can find out what they thought. So it really depends on your perspective on how much this kind of thing is gonna matter. But for those, and I think it's a pretty sizable group of people worldwide who are looking at the biblical and related conceptions, and they're applying that to modern politics, this does have some pretty significant implications, because say the modern nation state of Israel, yes, it's called Israel, but the people from the Second Temple period would not look at the modern nation state of Israel as actually being all of Israel, or being really properly calling itself Israel. It would be understood as a Jewish state. And there are Samaritans there. There's a few hundred Samaritans that continue to sacrifice at Mount Gerizim even today. So you've got some, but this is not the there's a whole group of say dispensationalist American Christians and Christians worldwide in certain respects, who look at, say, the rise of the modern nation state of Israel as a fulfillment of prophecy that Israel would be restored in the last days. Well, it's interesting. It's an interesting thought, but it certainly isn't what the prophets or any of the people, like Jesus or Paul or anybody from the Second Temple period, Philo or anybody else, they would not have looked at the modern nation state of Israel as that. They just said, that's a nice Jewish political state, but it is not restored Israel. Why? Well, where are the other tribes? Where's the tribe of Reuben? Where's the tribe of Gad? Where's the tribe of Asher? Where's the tribe of say Dan? All of these other things come into play there. Where are some other elements that are in the prophetic material supposed to be associated with the restoration of Israel? Those things are all lacking. And this is, by the way, why when the modern nation state of Israel was formed, there was some ambivalence, and even in some cases opposition toward it from certain Orthodox rabbis, who looked at this and said, we're the concern is that people are going to identify this as the fulfillment of the promise, but it's not. So it's not like this is a radical notion in that respect. It's been understood within rabbinic Judaism, and particularly on the more Orthodox side of things in that regard, for a long, long time. But essentially what I'm doing is I'm bringing that forward and saying, how should that impact? How should a more precise understanding of how these terms are used in this period impact our reading of the texts from that period? So it has implications for the present, but again, it depends on what perspective you're coming from on how much those implications are going to matter.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think on the personal side of it, the third part of that question, it was kind of, I guess, too, just like if an individual today, 2021, is reading through the Old and the New Testament, and they have the question that you had of what is the difference between Israel and Judah in this period, they would have turned to one of a few different places. One would be whatever Bible they're using, if that had notes in it. The other would be a dictionary. And so I guess the question is, does the dictionary, does that Bible commentary, is that all has that in mind as well? Like in the book here, you say the default idea nowadays is that those terms were equal. So if I'm looking at any other resource like a dictionary or something like that to try to understand these terms, that's the message I'm going to get from those as well, correct?
Yeah, that's been the default for so long that's what basically all of the reference materials and everything else have assumed for generations. Mm-hmm. And again, I'm basically coming forward and saying, that's not actually what the source material says if we look more closely. And so yeah, most study Bibles, Bible dictionaries, things like that they're going to be depending on Kuhn's 1937 article on this, and which is significantly misleading.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you identify, he wasn't just a Nazi, he was one of the first, like card carrying
Yeah.
member,
Well, not just card
excited and happy
carrying.
to
He
be it.
actually used to. This was something that was staggering. I found a reference of one of his old students, where his student was talking about those idyllic times back in the 30s when Dr. Kuhn uh, would would give lectures on rabbinic Judaism while wearing a Sturmabteilung, a SA uniform, with the honor dagger tinkling at his side. He had the honor dagger, with the inscription for being one of the first 1,000 members of the Sturmabteilung, which was it's the storm detachment, is what it means. But it was a Nazi paramilitary group that he had joined early on in the movement, and he would give his lectures on Judaism while wearing this Sturmabteilung uniform, which is just a staggering thought. I mean, yeah. And it's amazing to me also that his student, well after World War II, was reflecting back on those idyllic days, which I'm pretty sure a lot of other people wouldn't have regarded as idyllic. But in any case, that was a kind of amazing thing to think about. And this is ultimately who all of these, all of the default resources and everything have depended on for nearly 100 years. So, yeah.
Well, the book was amazing. And as I told you, as I was reading it, it could have been multiple books. I called it books within books. I mean, we haven't even gotten into diaspora. You have a whole chapter on that. And I mean, your findings in that are pretty incredible as well. What diaspora would have meant during that time. But then just going through all these texts too, it's like the greatest idea I have about reading of finding these things that have almost become lost to history. And it's almost a rediscovery of what these guys were saying. I mean, your chapter on Josephus was incredible in the sense that he is writing under Rome. He's writing for the Roman. He's writing a history for the Romans. Like they're paying him to write this.
Yeah, he's under Roman patron. He's actually a patron, or he's under the patronage of the Roman emperor at the time. So he's on the Roman payroll
as a Jew. But so he cannot, he has to be very careful how he writes. And you just point out multiple cases where he writes something that, had the Romans understood it, he probably wouldn't have been writing anymore. He probably would have lost that hand. But he does it in such a way that the Jewish audience would have understood exactly what he was saying, but it just flew right over the Romans' heads, or they just wouldn't have cared to look into it deeper. And that's just absolutely fascinating to pick up stuff like that in these ancient writings. And it's almost like a nugget we get in our day and age to identify something like that, but more of scholarship kind of views him as having turned in his thoughts and being under Roman patronage that changed his mentality. But you point out, no, like him writing these things would have been had they understood what he was saying, it would not have been ended well for him.
Right. Yeah. There are places where he is very clearly, if you know the passages in the Bible that he's actually referring to, which his Jewish readers would have, then you get that he's basically saying, yeah, Roman rule is here for now, but God's ultimately going to overthrow it, and Israel's going to come forward and, do their thing, and Rome will be subjugated just like all the other nations. But he doesn't say a word of it. Yeah. He just takes you right up to that and cites, one of the best examples of this is when he cites the prophecy of Daniel, of how the Romans are in fact going to receive this power, and they're going to destroy the temple and do all of these things. And, he's basically showing like how great our prophets are, that they even foresaw this stuff. He's like, yeah, the prophet Daniel, he saw this, and he saw the Romans coming, and the Romans would be favored by God, and that they would destroy the temple because of the unfaithfulness of God's people and all of these things. And then he says, and Daniel had more to say about what would come after that. But, let's just not get into that. We'll just stop here because, it's just really beyond the purview of our discussion. And if you know what he's referring to, the next lines after the destruction of the temple are, They have to do with the destruction of the people who destroy the temple, that God will come in and wipe them out and establish the everlasting and eternal rule of Israel. and so, he's like, yeah, and it also says more about what's coming after that. But, we're really more worried about what's already happened than, about the future. So, that's that. And he just takes you right up to the threshold. And a Jewish reader is going to be like, I know what it says. And the Romans are like, no Roman is presumably going to go and look up the citation. He's going to have to find where it is in the book of Daniel and then read it and then have it interpreted to him to explain, like, okay, so this was referring to us as the Romans, right? Okay, so what's this next part talking about? Well, yeah. I'm guessing that had a Roman decided to go and investigate that, there would have been some level of like not really wanting to cooperate in terms of guiding him to the right spots. So,
yeah.
So, this is the sort of thing that he does on more than one occasion where he says one thing and there's kind of a second layer to it. There's a hidden transcript, as James Scott has talked about, where, the people who are insiders on Josephus' side of things are going to get what he's saying, but nobody else is really going to get the subtext there. And it's sort of like when you quote a movie that you and a few buddies in the room know the next few lines of the movie, and you're all kind of laughing, but nobody else knows that was actually a movie quote that is insulting everybody in the room with the next lines, right? So that's the kind of thing that he does, while actually advocating that everybody just sit tight and not rebel against the Romans. Like, he's like specific about that. He's very quietistic in his approach, not because he's just a Roman stooge who's like, okay, well, I'm getting fat on the Roman payroll now, so we're all good, but because he believes that, if we try to do this without God's help, it's just going to backfire like it did with the temple. But God's promised he's going to set it right, and when it happens, they'll get theirs.
Yeah.
So
and then you see that idea across the other authors as well, where this idea of Israel it's not going to be a political thing. It's good. God is going to be doing it. It's so they multiple different authors there said something similar, where, don't try to rebel against the people, even though you're under exile. It's not fun. It's not pleasant, but yeah. And you write a lot about that, the good figs, the bad figs. It just really interesting stuff. I loved it.
Yeah. So to give everybody some indication of what you're talking about with the good figs and bad figs, that's a reference to one of the prophets, where the people who had been left behind in the land after other people had been taken out of the land looked at the other people and they were like, yeah, God took out the garbage and, left all of us behind. Those people were the ones that were holding us down. And the prophet basically comes in and says, no, God picked the good figs. The rotten ones are the ones left in the land. And so this is the reference that you're getting there. But again, that's an example of how you can cite something that isn't necessarily that isn't necessarily stated. And like, if your audience doesn't know it, it's gonna go over everybody's head. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, let's close out with a few questions. And the first, you alluded to it with speaking about Kuhn, but I was just curious if there are any other findings. I mean, this was 17 plus years of your life, the research. Kuhn, discovering his Nazi roots and how that impacted our modern day conception of Jew and in the terms Jew in Israel. What were one or two other findings from this research that ended up in this book that really surprised you?
Oh, one of them actually led to the diaspora Judaism chapter that you were talking about. I remember looking at there was a chapter by Louis Feldman, who's one of the main. He's a giant in Josephus research from the 20th century. And he made this bizarre comment, what I thought was bizarre, where he said, Josephus obviously took a positive view of, diaspora and exile. And I was like, that's weird. Why would, put yourself in Josephus' shoes. This is a Jewish priest based in Jerusalem who was nationalist enough to fight against the Romans initially. Like he says he was a general of the Jewish forces in the Jewish revolt before basically his platoon got destroyed and then he defected to the Romans. You know, he knew where his butter was bred, or where his bread was buttered, and you know, went defected to the Romans, and then proceeded to watch his city get burned, and his, you know, a variety of priestly colleagues and friends and everything else get butchered. I mean, the amount of the massacre, the massacres that this man saw of his own countrymen and of his own friends and colleagues and all of this, not cool. And you're going to tell me that this guy then, once he goes to Rome, just because he's eating well on the payroll of the Roman emperor, is now two thumbs up to diaspora? That seemed to me really strange. So I was like, what in the world is going on with this? And I did some more digging into that, and I discovered that the whole thing traced back to another actually German scholar and a couple others beyond that. But basically, there was this whole trend towards this idea, and it wasn't spelled out in Feldman's article because he was just leaning on this assumption from other stuff, that essentially after the return from exile that is narrated in Ezra and Nehemiah in the Bible, after you had some Jews return and the temple get rebuilt, since Jews, you know, who were in exile could conceivably have returned to the land, but many didn't. Obviously, many Jews outside the land, the default sort of paradigm for people living outside the land basically became diaspora is good. Diaspora is a positive thing. Diaspora is what we actually prefer. We like living, you know, in this context. And so the prior theological notion that exile is punishment from God is basically just dropped in favor of a more positive diaspora theology. This is that idea. And again, I kind of stumbled on this because of this weird statement, what I thought was weird, from Feldman. And so then I dug at the roots of that assumption. Like, okay, is it actually the case that we have good evidence for Jews in the diaspora taking a positive view of diaspora? And when you look at the evidence that was presented for it, it falls apart as soon as you like blow on it. It's and all of a sudden it just completely falls over, and you go, wait a second, there's no evidence of this. There's still, you know, all of these texts and all of these passages are still referring to diaspora and exile and all of these things in exceedingly negative terms. So where did this come from? And there's some, I don't want to spoil, you know, all of that, but in the book, you know, I go into a lot of what's going on there in terms of some of the proclivities of the modern scholars that basically are reading this. And of course, many modern Jews do take a positive view of this, and many of them, many scholars, I think, read their own attitudes essentially into the Jews of the Second Temple period, even though those attitudes are not actually matched within the text. I mean, there's one particular scholar who I love to death. He's a lovely, a great person. And that's one of the things that's, I think, really important to get across about scholarship is, you know, you disagree with people that you really like.
Yeah.
That's part of the game. But he makes this comment that, well, you know, there's all these various texts that are written in the Second Temple period that are really negative about exile, and they talk about exile and diaspora in a variety of ways. But I mean, obviously that doesn't apply to their own situation. You know, they're taking a much more positive view of their own situation because, you know, they're talking about exile, and that has to do with, you know, the past, right? And I'm like, wait a second. So you're telling me that all the stuff that these people are writing that's really negative doesn't apply to their own situation? Like, why are they writing it? And these are the sorts of things that ultimately, you know, I take on in that chapter and some of the chapters that follow it. That was startling to me, though. It was looking at that, and there were a few other places where I'll limit to one other one where I kept seeing scholars contrasting, like, well, you know, obviously, you know, the assumption, obviously, Jews in this period regarded themselves as the whole of Israel, and, you know, the north was basically forgotten, and, you know, Jews had taken over the whole heritage of Israel. Now, there does seem to be a little bit of an exception here in, say, First and Second Chronicles, but that's different from Ezra and Nehemiah, where obviously they're just, you know, they're all about the only Israelites are Jews. And then I'd find another article by someone on Ezra Nehemiah who'd be like, well, obviously, these are the Jews claim the whole heritage of Israel and all that, but this section of Ezra really takes a different perspective on this, and it's its own exception here, unlike all of these other. And I keep finding this stuff and go, you guys should really talk, right? I mean, the exceptions start piling up to where maybe those aren't exceptions, maybe that's the rule. And maybe the best example of that is in Ezra Nehemiah, where scholars for a long time, modern scholars for a long time, have regarded the events of Ezra Nehemiah, where people are returning from exile in the Persian period, as the fulfillment of prophecy, that this is Israel's restoration. And you have articles that are written on the restoration period, and that this is the restoration promised by the prophets. But then if you read Ezra Nehemiah carefully, it presents itself as not the restoration. Like the main characters, the protagonists of the story, refer to this as, well, God has given us, just a little reviving, but we're still slaves in our own land. And there's still these efforts at sort of corporate repentance to try to get the real thing happening. And each time it fails. And over again, the whole thing, Ezra Nehemiah is sort of an account of multiple failures to produce the restoration that they're hoping for. And then you look at how all of these Jews in the Second Temple period who refer to Ezra and Nehemiah after the fact, how they read the book, and all of them read it that way. They don't read it as the restoration of Israel. And so you have the modern scholarly construct that differs with how the Jews of that period are actually reading these things. And again, that was one of those things that was really surprising to look at some of the contrasts there as it came across.
Yeah. Wow. You may have covered this in the book. I may have read right over it, but do we know when the term Jew was first used? Was it pre-exile or was it post-exile?
It's pre-exile. So the first time that the term Jew, and actually in this case it's Yehudim or Yehudi, the Hebrew form of it that gets translated as Jew, is in the book of Jeremiah. Now Jeremiah is edited in the post-exilic period, so after the exile, after the destruction of the temple. So but it occurs in a pre-exilic context, and probably material that was written or whatnot right at around the time of the destruction of the southern kingdom, and it refers specifically to people from Judah. So that term Yehudi refers to an inhabitant of Judah, a person who is from the kingdom of Judah. And then when they go into exile, they then retain that same thing, that if you travel to Scotland, you are an American. And the same thing is the case for people from Judah. They take the name Yehudim from being from Judah. And so it's a term that essentially means Judahite. And Jew is just short essentially for Judahite. And you can hear that Judah. That's what it ultimately means then. And my argument in the book is that central meaning basically obtains. It stays as the central sense of the term throughout the Second Temple period, that it continues to be associated with Judah in a specific sense, rather than used in a broader sense as a synonym for Israelite.
Okay. Well, good. Well, if you are still listening at this point, we know you're interested in this. And what Jason is going to do later this year is to run a sort of a seminar where we go through this book. So if that's something that would be interesting to you, we'll have more information in the show notes, and I'll highlight that on social media. But it'd be something where you'd sign up. We'll go through the book, maybe a chapter or two at a time over Zoom. So it doesn't matter where you are. And if you are interested in exploring this further, we'll have more details for you in the show notes.